Good evening. Thanks for joining. Today is Tuesday, September the 1st, and this is lesson number 27, Practical English. My name is Darcy. Thanks for joining tonight. Ordinarily, we would be talking about literature. The way the series works is each week of the month we cover a different topic: business, literature, science, geography. Last week we looked at science, astronomy, and we were going to be looking at literature, part of the literature series, ordinarily tonight. But I had a request instead of that to look at fine art. So, introducing a new series to our many ongoing series, and this will be, I think, part one of a 2 or 3, probably just 2-part series, looking at modern artists. If we want to look at classical artists, that will be a very long series, and we can come to that at some point. Anyway, I put that into the geography, history, and social studies subject area. So we'll be looking at modern artists, not the classical artists like Leonardo da Vinci or, the history of Western art. That's not the goal tonight. I'd just like to maybe give you guys the names of some of the more popular, well-known modern artists. Artists that emerged at the end of the 20th century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Prior to that, you had the classical traditions. So you'll get an understanding of, in tonight's lesson, you'll get an understanding of what distinguishes modern art from classical art a little bit, and who were the artists that, who were the artists that started it all. So here's what you can expect in this lesson. It's the first part of a series presenting a timeline of Western artistic and cultural movements with a focus on painters and their works from the end of the 19th century up until the present day. So those movements are Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Expressionism, Abstract Art, Surrealism, Urban Art, and Digital Multimedia. In tonight's lesson, we're just going to be focusing on the Impressionists. I hope you've heard of the term Impressionist before. I did put a question out to the study group as to, asking students in there, who are your favorite artists? And a lot of the feedback I got were names of, popular Impressionist artists. And I have to say that I think my favorite art period is the Impressionist art period as well. So that's what we'll be looking at tonight, the Impressionist artists, who they were, and, what characterizes their style a little bit, what were their most famous works. We're not going to be doing too much of critique or analysis. We just want to kind of get an introduction into who they were and what their paintings were. So if you recognize a painting that you've always liked, but you didn't know who the painter was, hopefully tonight you'll learn about those popular Impressionist painters. And in the next lesson, we'll be looking at what art movements came after that. For example, abstract art and surreal art, and modern day digital art, I guess. Tonight, we'll be looking at the artists Claude Monet, Pierre Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, Eduard Manet, Paul Cezanne, Edgar Degas, Paul Gaogen, George Pierre Seurat, and Vincent van Gogh. At the end of the lesson, I'll be providing a link or QR code that you can scan to join the WeChat study group. Again, if you haven't been watching these lessons, this is where I post information, links to upcoming lessons, information on previous lessons. Good evening. Thanks for joining. I also provide like the slides of this lesson and normally a worksheet too. The worksheet we're not going to look at now, but I will be uploading a worksheet and these lesson slides after this lesson has been recorded so that you can reference it later. Of course, if you would like to support my work, please do invite your colleagues, friends, and family to join in these lessons here. Now, before we go any farther, I have a little bit of a disclaimer. These are paintings that deal with mature themes. So, be forewarned that, some of these great works of art do feature, like nude imagery. Okay. But it's, well, let's just dive right into it, right? Here's a perfect example. I think you've seen this painting before. This is Eugene Delacroix, by the way. So the modern art movement, this kind of imagery is nothing new to the modern art movement. Nude painting goes all the way back, nude painting and sculpture goes all the way back to the very origins, the very earliest works of art. So that's nothing new. Modernism, okay, so like I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson that we had the classical period and then the modern period. I've done lessons on the evolution of the classical into the modern era with the science history lesson series as well as the architectural styles lesson. For more information, I'll be posting links to that at the study group later on. But the classical period lasted up until the scientific, technological, industrial revolution, basically. Once society harnessed the power of machines and technology, civilization changed, the lifestyle and landscape changed from like agrarian and living in harmony with nature to urban, industrial, and so on. So this period of around the late 19th century, 1850, 60, 70, up until 1910, this is the Industrial Revolution, and it was a very exciting period in Western history. Lots of very interesting, powerful cultural, artistic movements were born during this era. So modernism is a term used by historians to define the time period and the cultural artistic movements that occurred after the period of the scientific industrial revolution up until the end of the Second World War. After that, you had sort of postmodernism. Prior to the 19th century, painting and the fine arts were largely confined to depictions of religious and mythic or historical scenes, landscapes, still life imagery, and portraiture. So, this is kind of an example, this painting here, of a historic battle scene. It's full of symbolism, but it's right at the end of the classical style, the classical period of painting. So this painter would have been very popular during the lives of these Impressionist painters, and so this is a very iconic painting. And what does it symbolize? Well, it symbolizes the French Revolution, the people's popular democratic uprising against the monarchy, and all of the ideas, philosophies associated with that. Modern era painters, so the painters that came after this period, were liberated, so to speak, from the expectations to conform to the traditional styles and themes. So, to be a painter, you had to graduate from a painting academy, and the academy, the teachers and the alumni, I suppose, would judge the work of painters, and if it met, the criteria, adhered to the standard, it would be allowed to be displayed in exhibitions, and then the painter could have a career as a painter. But they were restricted to painting scenes from history, painting religious and mythical scenes, or portraits of nobility, and still life, or landscape. Modern era painters were liberated from that. They began to express themselves more personally, taking inspiration from the contemporary world and society around them, rather than from the traditional arts masters, looking at the classical works and trying to copy classical works. I have a video that will explain some of this later on. So, the Impressionist painters. Impressionism. An impression is like the initial feeling that you get for the first time when you see something. Okay, it's a bit like how you remember something in your mind, an impression. You see something and then you recall a memory of it. That's an impression in your mind. So Impressionism as a modern artistic movement originated in Paris, France, by a small group of art students studying at the Paris Academy of Fine Arts. Now, their styles and subject matter differed from the traditionally accepted norms, and therefore wouldn't be displayed in the Paris Salon Art Gallery, which was an important cultural center of the day. Art critics also mocked their works as being amateur and ugly. These artists were not trying to. These artists weren't amateurs. They were traditionally classically trained. However, they were trying to be innovative. They wanted to, represent. They wanted to document. So part of the reason why, the painting that we looked at earlier, this one here, right? This would have been done in a studio with oil paint on a very large canvas. I'm not sure how large this one is, but the classical paintings could be the size of, they could be as large as 2 to 3 meters in height and 6 to 8 meters in length. They were gigantic. There were small paintings. There were also very large paintings. And these took months and months and months to prepare. Now, the Impressionists, they lived during an exciting era, and they were very, this was before the era of photography, or the very early days of photography, and they sought to try to document the world around them as it was changing. For example, because of the Industrial Revolution, the old traditional agrarian way of life was changing, transforming. It was a societal revolution. Cities were being built, and anyway, so the old world was transforming into the new world, and these artists recognized that they were those living through that period, and they wanted to capture as much of it as they could. So a lot of these Impressionist painters painted hundreds of paintings, and they did it quite quickly. They weren't perfectionists. They didn't really care to spend their time on making a masterpiece, as they did just wanting to make a little sketch and move on to the next piece. They also painted using pastels. So these are like crayons. So some of their works were done with watercolor, a kind of a paint that you add water to it. Some of them were oil paint, and then some of them were pastels. And the benefit of using pastels is that it was easy to carry with you. And then you could take it, wherever you went, basically, and you could do a quick little small sketch and have it ready in a few hours, basically, right? So Impressionist painting is defined partly by the themes chosen by the artist. In other words, instead of doing historical, religious, mythical scenes, they would just paint what's around them. Outdoor landscapes, a landscape, as you can see here, this is an urban landscape. Still life, portraiture, and scenes from modern life. And portraiture is a painting of an individual. Portraiture up until the modern time generally was like reserved for the nobility. In other words, a rich person, an elite member of sort of the ruling family, a duke, a duchess, a lord, would consign an artist to paint their portrait. And they would own that portrait, and then after their death or whatever, that portrait, if it was painted by a master, would be put on display at an exhibition. So a lot of the great paintings done by the classical masters were portraits, very realistic portraits of high-ranking nobility. The modern-day artists were painting portraits of their friends or those around them, right? So, painting employs many short, broken brush strokes. Again, they did it quickly. And they also, enjoyed this kind of style, the visual effect that it produced. Instead of using long, slow, deliberate brush strokes, little short brush strokes. Probably able to sketch something out quickly and then work out the details later. Pale colors as well, using a kind of a color palette. Avoidance of hard-line contours, producing visual effect rather than clear detail. So as you can see as we look at this painting here, it's a little blurry, it's a little washed out. If you were to stand looking at this painting from far away and you were to squint your eyes a little bit, you would, recognize that it's a picture of a road with apartment buildings on either side and street lamps and even cars. I think maybe those are cars. I can't really tell, right? The detail is blurred out. So the avoidance of hardline contours. They weren't too concerned with the detail. They weren't too concerned that the viewer could really make out clearly what the painting depicts. And again, like an emphasis on doing the work quickly, using pastels, working in the field. So, how does the story go as far as how Impressionism was born? Well, it says here, the styles and subject matter differed from traditionally accepted norms, and so these art students their works were rejected by the Academy, so they couldn't be put on display at the art salon, Paris Art Salon Art Gallery. However, the emperor at the time, French Emperor Napoleon III, was sympathetic and allowed the paintings that were rejected by the Academy to be put on public display in a separate gallery. To the surprise, and that gallery was called Le Salon des Refus, so the gallery of the rejected paintings is how that translates from French. And to the surprise of critics, the public enthusiastically accepted this new style of painting. As a result of these painters, artistic, literary, and musical invention was reinvigorated. So some new artistic style was put on display. People had something to talk about. It really reflected their time, and this caused a great deal of excitement for other artists, such as writers and musicians. I have this. Okay, so the Impressionistic and Post-Impressionistic art movement predominantly took place in France. There are some lesser-known artists and later artists taking influences from these French painters in Spain, in Italy, in Denmark, the Netherlands, and Germany, I suppose, and Russia too, as well as Canada and the United States. Impressionism first started in France, but its influence spread across Europe to Spain, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Russia, and also the New World, America, and Canada. Actually, I do need to do a lesson on the Canadian Impressionist painters. They were Europeans that came to Canada and painted Canada. So we'll talk about that in the next art lesson. Early Impressionists included Claude Monet, Pierre, Auguste, Renoir, Alfred Sisley, Frederic Bazille, Eduard Manet, Camille Pissarro, Paul Cezanne, Edgar Degas, and so on. Okay? So we'll look at a few of these people tonight.
One of the most significant movements for modern art is Impressionism. But did you know the word impressionist was first used as an insult? The term Impressionism comes from a scathing critique by Louis Leroy, which described one hated painting as a mere impression. The painting referred to in this brutal review was Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise. Impressionism was born during a time when the best-loved themes were religious and historical, and the French Academy of Fine Arts supported realistic renditions fervently. Landscapes and still-life pictures were deemed inferior, while portraits and historical paintings were highly prized. Young artists including Claude Monet, Pierre Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Frederic Bazille differed significantly from the Academy in their views and artistic styles. One of these young artists, Eduard Manet, was a classically trained painter and studied with an established master, copying paintings at the Louvre. Manet experienced regular rejection from the French Academy and led impassioned discussions about the Academy's stifling traditional perceptions and practices. Little did anyone know that the Academy's rejection of Manet's Luncheon on the Grass in 1863, accompanied with a strongly worded missive, would spark off a revolution in the world of art. After more than half of the art pieces submitted that year were rejected by the French Academy, the public demanded to be able to judge the rejected work for themselves. In response to this public outcry, Emperor Napoleon III created the Salon of the Refused to let the public enjoy the rejected works. The Salon of the Refused exposed the world at large to the existence of an entirely new style and technique. In 1876, 3 years after the Salon's debut, Impressionism entered its age of glory, which would last until 1886. We now know how the Impressionist movement started, but what makes Impressionist art Impressionist? Impressionist art depicts a scene in the way as if the viewer might have only caught the scene with a glance. The paintings from this era are characterized by short brushstrokes, that give the overall impression of the object or person rather than a finely finished and detailed work. Vibrancy is a critical aspect of the Impressionist canvas, and Impressionist artists ensured vibrancy through the use of dominant colors laid close together, unblended. Impressionist subject matter was as innovative as their technique. Deviating from the historical themes of the French Academy, many Impressionists painted contemporary scenes of urban life. One way vibrancy was depicted was in the play of natural light. Monet depicts natural light faithfully in his Woman with a Parasol. In this work, Monet captures his wife and son in an outdoor setting where the bright sunlight touches the top of Camille's parasol and the flowers beneath her feet tinge the front of her dress. The sheer life of the painting, the sense of open space and warmth of the sunlight all combine to create a real-life scene for the viewer. All of this was achieved without the artist realistically finishing his central characters. Renoir was another Impressionist artist who chose to challenge the Academy with his depiction of risque and pretty maidens. Renoir and Monet together worked over a 2-month period where they perfected the style that would later be called Impressionism. During Renoir's early career, he had a passion for portraiture, which he carried with him even after his style grew more impressionistic. In fact, it is said that his success with portraits gave him the financial freedom to explore new techniques with landscapes and still lifes. Renoir's well-known Dance at the Moulin de la Galette showed his ability to communicate to the viewer a joyful and vivacious environment using a play of colors and subtle lighting techniques. The critics at the time were not happy with this work at all, though Dance at the Moulin de la Galette is deemed one of the best Impressionist masterpieces ever created. If you've ever seen depictions of ballerinas by Degas, you'll understand why he is known as the master when depicting the human figure in motion. He did not fully abandon the classical technique in favor of the unfinished style of rough and bold brushstrokes that the Impressionists favored. This was especially evident when it came to the clarity of outline and continuity of contours in his work. However, his style definitely took an Impressionist slant, and this is clear when you take a look at his later works that prominently featured ballet dancers. Degas, who's considered to be one of the founders of this complex era, actually rejected the term Impressionism and preferred to be known as a realistic artist. In the late 1880s, there was yet another revolution in the art world, where a group of young artists once again chose to adopt a style divergent from the popular Impressionist style. Paul Cezanne was the oldest member of this group of rebels, which included the likes of Vincent van Gogh and Gauguin. Known as a post-impressionist, Cezanne was doubtlessly inspired by the new style that Impressionism had given birth to. However, his inclination was to do away with the naturalism that Impressionists embraced. Symbolism was becoming the next big thing, although the style borrowed from Impressionist techniques quite heavily. Cezanne's work also differs from that of the early Impressionists by bringing a balance between the visual elements and the harmony of colors used. The Small Forest is one of his paintings that captures the essence of this Impressionist style perfectly, both in terms of showcasing his exquisite brushwork and his shift to a lighter, brighter palette to depict outdoor scenes. Cezanne's focus on creating structured paintings and carefully modulating color lay at the foundations for the revolutionary artistic style of Cubism. Outside of visual art, writers and composers experimented with Impressionist techniques as well. Charles Baudelaire's volume of poetry, The Flowers of Evil, inspired the symbolist movement in literature, which, like Impressionist artwork, communicated through non-formulaic impressions, with the goal of expressing the essence of a subject rather than reproducing it. Inspired by such poets, composer Claude Debussy deviated from the rigid formal structures such as the sonata and symphony in favor of less rigidly defined tonalities tailored to express the emotional themes of his work. Impressionism undoubtedly defied the traditions of European art. By doing so, it pushed the boundaries of artistic freedom and forever changed the way we define art.
So, yeah, really to sum up what Impressionism is, it's unfinished. So let's continue. Let's look at some of those artists that were mentioned in that video. Okay, Claude Monet is the one that started it all. A French painter, founder of the Impressionist movement. Again, rather than striving for realism, where using artistic techniques of lighting and shading and contour and the blending colors using different kinds of artistic tools, different kinds of paintbrushes and knives and so on, striving for realism, they really could produce like almost photorealistic or more than realistic effect, these great classical masters. They certainly had perfected painting to the degree that they could manipulate the paintings so that it didn't even appear two-dimensional. It could actually look like it was three-dimensional and living even. But these Impressionist painters wanted to move in a different direction. So rather than striving for realism, they attempted to recreate perception. In other words, how the scene looked and felt to the artist in that scene. Like the artist was as much a part of the scene as the scene itself, basically, in the way that the artist perceived the scene. Using lighting, shading, and brushstrokes that were radically blurring the edges to create the dreamlike feel. And the inspiration that Claude Monet took was from the French countryside, painting scenes of rivers and gardens and ordinary people. So we saw this painting in the video, the woman with the parasol, his wife and child. From a unique angle. Again, like the angle is important too. These Impressionist painters chose angles that had never been tried before, basically. And this is the painting, I forgot the name of it. I think it was the Impression Sunset that he said. This was the painting that got the big rejection. And it's quite messy, I must say. But the choice of color does give you that kind of a feeling of early dawn, I believe, or late sunset, Impressionist sunset, and how the fog of the water coming off of the river blurs vision. And what else is interesting about this painting is that it looks industrial. You can see smokestacks from a factory off in the distance. And this is ugly in terms of like how the critics would judge something like this. Nobody really wants to look at this and appreciate it. Industrial factories. It's not something you really want to, stand in awe of. However, that's something that Monet chose. And it's a painting that sort of changed the course of history. So a very common scene during his day of, people out on rafts in a port area, in an industrial port area at sunset. It's not particularly beautiful, but it is emotionally provocative, let's say. This is more of a classic Monet here. Field of poppies. I'll be sharing these later, so you can look at them at length, I suppose. So the color, the contrast, the shading, and the squiggly lines are the signature style of Monet. And also, I think he's best known for all of the painting that he did in the gardens, painting these really washed out scenes of rivers and willows and these water lilies and bridges and so on. I think the older he got, the more his vision deteriorated. So it was also his physical condition and his inability to see very clearly that, gave us this style of painting that other painters sought to copy or emulate, were influenced by it. Okay, moving on to Renoir. So all of these painters were, they sort of knew each other. They came from the same art academy in France. They knew each other quite personally. Pierre Auguste Renoir, another French artist who led the French Impressionist painting movement, took more inspiration from people. So he was more of a portrait artist. It says here he took inspiration from feminine sensuality and painted mainly portraits and scenes of people at social gatherings, friends of his. So Renoir was a master of capturing people in the Impressionist style and their manner of dress and their, facial expressions. Lighting is important too. So under a canopy of trees, you can see the light coming through in little patches, I think. And again, you can kind of imagine the crowd. It's difficult to make out individual people, particularly in the background, but you get the sense that there's a lot of people there, with yellow hats and white dresses and black suits and so on. And I believe the couple off to the left is Renoir himself, I believe. So a lot of portraiture. The bottom left is Monet, his friend, Claude Monet. That's a portrait of the artist Monet there. That's Renoir. Sicily, lesser known. I don't think many people would recognize many of these paintings, but he was among the original Impressionists. Painted a lot of landscapes. Painted and sketched landscapes, French countryside. So this is Sicily. Eduard Manet. So Eduard Manet is an interesting character. Considered to be one of the most important modern artists, despite the fact that during his lifetime his work did not receive favorable reviews by critics. I guess you could say that if you look at this portrait, for example, the subject, the person, is in the air. Is how they say it. There's no background to it. It's just one person, and that's why the critics would say this is unfinished. Where's the rest of the scene? It's just sort of a person detached from the background. And he also took he took some political jabs, I think, like He would depict scenes of political violence, and this is a boy in a soldier's outfit. In war, they would send children out to play music for the band. Like these were marching musicians that were there to motivate the soldiers. So children went out with soldiers in war. So perhaps there is some commentary or criticism being made by Manet in these kinds of paintings. He was a political rebel, obviously disdained by the ruling class, and he had deep convictions about his artistic vision. So he saw his art not only as a way of expressing himself artistically or journalistically capturing the world around him, but he also had some ambition to like reform or critique society according to his political philosophy. And for this reason, he gave that dimension, that aspect to the Impressionist movement, and it was really exciting for artists, other painters, and writers and musicians. The painting itself was one thing, interesting to look at, but the artist was injecting some ideas, some radical revolutionary ideas in as well, to the excitement of the French artistic community of the day, as well as just he was a very gifted, talented painter as well. So we've all seen this painting here. Just a common waitress or bartender, but immortalized in this in this masterpiece. This was a very controversial painting. Not sure why. Maybe because it's messy. I don't know. We'll move on from this one. Friends of Manet, some of these people were writers, philosophers. Some of these people were common beggars. I believe this person to the lower left was just a street beggar. The person to the upper right was an essayist, a poet and an essayist writing articles, parties, people having conversations and so on. So that's Manet there. Monet and Manet. Degas, we saw this in the video. We saw this with this individual here. Among the Impressionist painters, he preferred to be identified as a realist. He didn't really want to be associated as somebody who didn't finish their work. He's considered to be one of the masters in his ability to capture movement. So Degas is best known for his ballerinas. He did painting and sculpture. So capturing movement, almost like photographic. But the attention was really on the subject, the people, and not the background. So the background is a little blurred out, and therefore impressionist. But he did employ those traditional styles of painting to his subjects, in terms of lighting and shading and contour, and attention to detail. And these are the sculptures. He also did sculptures too. I believe this is the last of the Impressionists. And now we'll look at Post-Impressionism. Post means after, and in response to. So these artists of the post-impressionistic period happens at the same time, I would say, but they were influenced by the Impressionist painters, and as we heard in the video, they had divergent ideas. So The Impressionist painters had their own philosophy in terms of how the painting should be structured and what elements it should have, what color palette it should have. And it really needs to be naturalist. Like, if not striving for realism, it does need to adhere to depicting a realistic scene. Whereas the Post-Impressionists would be more keen on putting in their own symbolism. Post-Impressionism. A reaction against the Impressionists' concern for naturalistic depiction. By the way, depiction means representation or recreation. Depiction. So, we're still here. So these post-impressionist painters took things to the next level. They were extremist in their impressionistic techniques. Okay, so they wanted to be more expressive, more individualistic, less like they wanted to be even more expressive. The Impressionists tried to capture a scene quickly and give the artists like impression, but not putting too much subjective interpretation into the scene. And it usually had to be a scene that they were there capturing. A post-impressionist could come up with some sort of imaginary scenes with some symbolic meaning to it. So they tended to be more expressive, more abstract, more symbolic, more imaginative, more experimental. The well-known post-impressionists, there's a lot of them. There's all of those subgroups or later styles that came out after the Impressionistic period around Europe. And I'll be talking about some of those in the next modern artist lesson. But as far as we're concerned tonight, the post-impressionist painters were Paul Cezanne, Paul Gauguin, Georges Pierre Seurat, and Vincent van Gogh.
Post-Impressionism emerged around 1885 and held sway in the artistic world until around 1914. Post-Impressionist artists aimed to make art an emotional experience through the use of symbolism, vibrant colors, and captivating forms. Post-Impressionism can be thought of as an exaggerated form of the Impressionism that came before. Like Impressionists, Post-Impressionists focused on what viewers might see if they only caught a glimpse of the scene portrayed. A major difference between the two movements was that instead of focusing on displaying light and color in a naturalistic manner like Impressionists, Post-Impressionists used more calculated juxtapositions and symbolism as tools to convey meaning in their work. Another difference was that Post-Impressionists chose rural scenes and everyday subjects for their paintings over Impressionism's high-fashion urban scenes. The impressions recorded by Post-Impressionists were less journalistic and more highly personal, and artists' thick brushstrokes drew attention to the expressivity of their art. The Post-Impressionist movement was initiated by a few independent artists. Paul Cezanne was the oldest of this group, which also included masters like Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, and Georges Seurat. Seurat had begun experimenting with color even before the Post-Impressionist movement took shape. He placed dabs of pure color next to each other instead of mixing them, like traditional artists did. That way, the viewer's eye could blend the painting's colors, which meant that the same painting could appear differently to different individuals. Cezanne used thick daubs of color throughout his work, often applying the paint with a palette knife. He experimented with reducing objects to basic geometric forms. Cezanne portrayed various elements as simplistic shapes and laid them out flat on the canvas, giving a decidedly abstract look and feel. His greatest complaint with the Impressionist tradition was that it did not allow artists to refine and harmonize the visual elements in the picture. This was the basis for the Cubist movement, which would grow out of Post-Impressionist art. Cezanne revived interest in the still life, which had been neglected by artists for nearly 300 years. His thick daubs of paint added dimension and expressivity to the still life objects. His real innovation, however, was incorporating multiple perspectives of still life objects in a single work. One example of this is the scene of apples spilling across a table next to an imbalanced stack of cookies in Cezanne's still life, The Basket of Apples. The cookies and apples in the painting are portrayed with multiple viewpoints, multiple locations, and moments in time. While Cezanne specifically avoided playing with light and shadow as his Impressionist predecessors did, the objects he features are vibrant and vivid because of his textured application of carefully juxtaposed color gradations. For Georges Seurat, it was Impressionism's lack of lines and detailing that led him to Post-Impressionist style. Seurat's technique is known as Pointillism, although he preferred to call it divisionism, referring to his calculated division of color splotches to retain color's vibrancy, instead of watering down colors in mixing them. Seurat wanted viewers to mix the vibrant colors using their own imagination and eyes. With this technique, Seurat could bring in subtle shading and some very interesting color blends. Seurat's large-scale painting, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jeté, is his most widely recognized work. Le Grand Jeté depicts boaters, animals, and a fashionably dressed Sunday crowd taking in the view of the Seine. Seurat admired the classic art of the Renaissance and Egyptian art, Greece and Roman. The large-scale and serious tone of his best-known painting hint at many classical themes. Unlike classic paintings, however, Seurat's work is not meant to prescribe or teach. The relationships between the people in the painting are up for interpretation, and the abstract impressions of their faces invite viewers to decide what their feelings and thoughts might be. Although Post-Impressionists like Cezanne and Seurat made their displeasures with the Impressionist technique known, they were still heavily influenced by this style. Another well-known artist from this time is Vincent van Gogh. He moved further away from the Impressionist ideas than Seurat and Cezanne did. Along with his troubled artist personality, Van Gogh is remembered for his masterpieces, The Starry Night, Sunflowers, and Café Terrace at Night. For Van Gogh, art was about color above all else. In this respect, he had an Impressionist mindset, but the scenes Van Gogh depicted were more of an instinctive response than a scientific study of the scene. That meant he did not always do the meticulous study of the light and color found in nature before transferring his impressions onto canvas. His science was juxtaposing colors which would enhance or understate certain elements of his work. Van Gogh also moved away from realism, but he never overlooked the emotional aspect of his art. In this respect, I would say that Van Gogh was a particularly spiritual post-impressionist. Paul Gauguin is another spiritual post-impressionist. In his painting The Yellow Christ, Gauguin depicts three kneeling Breton women praying at a grotto. Gauguin's use of simplistic lines, shapes, and exaggerated color show the intense emotional state of the praying group. Gauguin had successfully adopted the vibrant use of color that Impressionists favored and tweaked it to achieve his own personal style, one that aimed to draw the viewer in emotionally. The intense emotion of post-impressionist visual art inspired other artistic disciplines as well. Post-impressionist literature carried many of the same ideas over to writing in highly personal stream of consciousness novels like James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man and Virginia Woolf's Miss Dalloway. These novels challenged norms of literacy perspective and invited viewers into the increasingly symbolic and intensely emotional worlds of their protagonists. Although post-impressionist artists had been experimenting with their new styles for a while, The style began attracting followers and admirers only after art historian and critic Roger Fry arranged a post-impressionist exhibition in 1910. Fry, who incidentally discovered Cezanne's work, believed that the conventional art of the time was growing stale. He felt that the art world needed a shakeup of sorts, and that's exactly what he tried to achieve by displaying the art of Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Cezanne prominently. He called his show Manet and the Post-Impressionists. This was actually what gave the evolving style its name. The exhibition took the art world by storm, and Roger Fry did what he set out to do, to highlight the importance of emotional significance in art. The show brought substantial publicity to this emerging style. It also ensured that many more beginning and established artists would explore their own ways of challenging the limitations that Impressionism had imposed on their artistic expression. Post-Impressionist experimentation with color, form, and perspective would inspire Cubist artists like Pablo Picasso, Salvador Dali, and Juan Gris to stretch the limits of perspective, abstract form, and emotionality even further in the early 20th century.
Just to kind of sum up what we've, the main theme, the main point of this particular lesson is that up until you had all of these different art movements throughout the classical period, as the masters became even more skilled at depicting realism in landscape portraiture and these imaginary historical or mythical religious scenes. They probably did have models helping them. The Impressionists, the modern painters, were individualistic. They really just wanted to paint the world around them and to be prolific in capturing as much as they possibly could. And then, after 20 years of that, I suppose, 10 to 20 years of that, it opened up the space, let's say, culturally, for less talented or less trained artists to enter into the art world. So, the movements that followed from Post-Impressionism, you see more of a breaking down of discernible form into chaos. That's like abstract painting. And so next week we'll be looking at Picasso and the abstract painters and the surrealist painters. Maybe we'll do that next week. So, as I said, we've got 4 artists here. Cezanne, Paul Cezanne, French painter, important for his artistic contributions in conceiving new artistic styles. So he was like, if Manet was the last of the Impressionists, somewhere between the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, Cezanne was the first of the Post-Impressionists. And we can kind of see that, he was able to capture scenes realistically, although they do look kind of comical, like a drawing. These are clearly drawings, but they do have like realistic resemblance. But as his work progressed, it became more abstract. So this is two-dimensional. When I look at this, it looks two-dimensional to me. And as the video mentioned, the contrast or juxtaposition of color is his signature style. So he was an impressionistic painter, but he pushed the limits, particularly with his portraits. So these people are sort of distorted. I think they're a little bit distorted, and they look comical. Or what we call a caricature. A caricature is how do I describe a caricature? I don't know. There's a little bit more symbolism or the artist taking artistic liberty, let's say, to paint these people. I would say that like there's some exaggeration when I look at these things. The first thing I notice is the exaggeration or the warping of the shape of the head. The picture on the right, you have a man with small eyes and big ears, a small head and big shoulders. For whatever reason, he liked to paint people in this way, which allowed for like later painters like Picasso to warp the shapes even further. Picasso was heavily influenced by Cezanne. Okay, Seurat, a kind of a different painter, not doing what Cezanne was doing. Best known for his technique of drawing and painting referred to as Pointillism, a style by which small dots of color are applied rather than short brushstrokes. Small dots, like the way a printer would print a dot matrix printer, except you did it by hand. If we look at it in close detail, we can see this would have taken a very long time. Something like this would have taken a very long time to produce. And there was a lot of sort of mental conception put into it as well. If you analyze one segment in detail, you'll see that each dot is intentionally put there, each choice of color to produce the overall effect. So nobody had ever done something like this before, and this was his signature style. It wasn't like a very influential style. I don't think that this style took off, but as far as Seurat goes, like this, he was celebrated for that style that he came up with. So we've probably all seen this painting before, and he did do other paintings using the brush, but he's best known for this pointillist style. Here we have Van Gogh. So as far as the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, they're all great, but I would say that Van Gogh is the most widely celebrated and loved of the painters. A Dutch artist, so not a French painter, but a Dutch painter. Considered to be one of the most intelligent of the painters of his day and most famous of the painters in Western art to this day. He produced well over 2,000 paintings. Now, some of them are very small, but he produced well over 2,000 paintings and drawings in his short lifetime. And his subjects were portraits, landscapes, still images. He lived in poverty. So, he lived remotely from the art world, and there wasn't a large market for the work that he was producing. So while he was able to make a living as an artist selling his works, he wasn't very commercially successful. He suffered from depression, and he ended his life early. So there's a whole other psychological dimension to the works of Van Gogh. And I'll leave that up to you to interpret for yourself. So here we have, again, it's post-impressionist. There's more extreme distortion of reality, I think. Distortion of reality. Really nice reflection here of the stars on the lake, and yeah, everything's dreamlike. Everything is fluid, moving like water, I guess. Okay, and of course there are many more works by Van Gogh for you to check out. And the last one is Gaogen. This is the last one. Paul Gauguin is our last French post-impressionist artists. Also not very widely appreciated until after his passing. Gauguin is unique among these, this group of painters in his choice of subject matter. All of these painters are unique, and this one is unique for his choice of subject matter. Although he began his career in France, he later moved to a French colony in Polynesia, which is a small set of tropical islands in the South Pacific. And there he painted local indigenous people. So you didn't see much depiction of people of dark skin in this time by these painters. But because he lived in these Polynesian islands, it's kind of it's situated way off in the middle of the ocean, in the same on the same latitude as Australia, basically. So it's tropical, it's to the south, and it's remote. It's in the middle of nowhere. So he began his career in France, and then left for Polynesia and painted scenes from the set of islands, painting indigenous people. His later works is where he really took on his own individual style, and as the video says, Gaogen, along with Van Gogh and Seurat, would influence people like Picasso and Matisse, the abstract modern artists of the 20th century. And there's just more distortion, more interesting use of color, and the people don't look very realistic at this point. Or the scene isn't realistic because of the use of new colors and sort of a basic palette without much attention to shading. So that's all for tonight. Here is the link to the group where I will upload a worksheet with terminology that was mentioned in this lesson, and the slides to this lesson as well. So go ahead and join this group for the notes from this lesson and updates on upcoming lessons, and share this with your social network. It's now 8:15, so I'm going to say thank you for joining tonight. If you have any questions, please do reach out to me. Suggestions, comments, and what have you. Okay? So I look forward to seeing you at the Zhongnan Center this Friday for another one of these lessons, and next week, where I think we will be doing the continuation part 2 of these modern artists, before we go back into the usual rotation of geography, where we're looking at the United States and science and literature and so on. Okay, so as I said, questions, comments, suggestions, just send them to me here. And again, thank you for joining me tonight, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Good night. Bye for now.